Hey folks, it is the 28th of April 2025, and welcome to Tinfoil News. There is quite a lot that's happened since my last episode, and I really wanted to take time to catch up with that. Excuse me. Obviously, there's stuff going on in Ukraine and Iran, and I realize that I have focused on certain conflicts and things like that are happening in the world, and it kind of makes sense to do that, obviously, because these are the conflicts that are generally shaping people's opinions around the world, and particularly in the UK and Europe, which is really important to me. And really, I just want to kind of share my comments and opinions on what I'm seeing within the media and certain other sources, certain other various reporters you kind of find on YouTube as well. So, first things first, let's talk about Ukraine and what's going on with Ukraine. 'Cause where I left it last week, essentially Zelensky had blown up the deal in London. Blown up a meeting in London, I should say, and not literally, by the way, like just to the point where there was supposed to be a meeting in London with Macron, with Marco Rubio, with Keir Starmer, and a German representative as well, and of course Zelensky, and they were going to talk about how they were going to potentially end the Ukraine war. And it got to the point where Zelensky said he wasn't coming. He certainly went, and whatever representative was coming, I think that was Yermak, was going to be only have the ability to talk about certain things and not all things, which kind of doesn't make sense at all when you're trying to negotiate the end of a war. Everything's on the table, surely, right? Anyways, so more information has come out since that point about what actually happened, and I wanted to kind of share that with you. So on Reuters, for instance, there were a couple of articles which detailed that there was two plans that were essentially going to be presented at that meeting, one by the US and one by the EU. And we've seen details of those plans now, and it seems like the US one has been worked on for certainly since Trump has been in power. The European one, probably due more to the detail that we're seeing, looks like it's probably been worked on a bit longer. The problem is that the two plans don't marry. They're quite far apart from each other, and this is the American plan and the European plan. This is, forget the Russians for the moment, but the European plan is quite interesting in the sense that it basically says Russia has to get out of Ukraine. That's it. End of. That's how the war ends, and there will be European Defence Force or a reassurance force or whatever you want to call it, peacekeepers by another name, I would imagine, that need to go into Ukraine. And it seems like the Europeans have just gone for this very maximalist option to try and force the Russians to accept their terms, which is a bit bizarre because Ukraine is currently losing the war. So why would Russia accept Europe's terms on how to end the war? And part of those terms, one of them was for Russia to give back the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant and for it to come under the auspices of American control, which basically means Ukrainian control, because that's what would happen. So Russia has to give up the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. There have to be there has to be a unilateral ceasefire before any negotiations on how a peace treaty actually works. So I suppose that's kind of akin to the armistice at the end of the First World War. I think there was an armistice in 1918, and if I remember rightly, there was the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which basically forced Germany to its knees, and is one of the drivers for the Second World War. Most historians would agree with that. So we're in this really odd situation where Europe is demanding, or certainly proposing, not actually probably more demanding to be fair, is basically saying to Russia, no, it has to be. This is the way it has to end the war. Otherwise, yeah, we're not going to accept that. There's no talk about sanctions relief or anything like that, um, which which is odd because it seems to feel like to me that Europe is gearing up to fight Russia. That's what this looks like. We're buying time. Um, that's what happened at the end of 2014 when Russia essentially annexed Crimea. And they did that. And by the way, I'm not advocating that companies go and annex other parts of other countries, but there is a certain logic to why they annexed Crimea. Not it was mainly because their naval base in Sevastopol, uh, which is really really important for them. I think it's their only warm water naval base. All the rest of them are Arctic or Cold War naval bases. So super important that they felt, well, for them it was super important for them that they maintained that base. And when you've got a hostile country that's just gone through a coup that's been funded by your long term enemy, which is America, you can see the writings on the wall for that potential base. So you can see why they felt they had to go in. It makes sense. It's not good. It's not nice, but that's what happens. This is the real world. People protect what they have. So that's part of why Crimea got annexed in the first place. But Zelensky and certainly with the backing of his European allies are essentially taking the position of all lands must go back to Ukraine, which is not going to happen because Russia's just too strong. So how do you force someone who's actually stronger than you to give up something when they don't want to? You can't. It's just simple logic, unfortunately. So there seems to be a dislocation to reality that's going on in Europe at the moment. You've also got Germany reindustrializing, rearming. Essentially, their their economy has been doing really, really badly since the Russian pipeline, which was Nord Stream 1 and 2. What now? I think both of them have been shut in. One of them was destroyed. I think one of them was damaged. What was super interesting was that even before the special military operation, Biden is on record saying that will be sorted out, that will be taken out. There's video footage of that. You can go look for yourself. Just yeah, it's pretty wild. And I suppose that kind of alludes to just this nonsense that we see in the world where people tell you what they're going to do before they actually do it and then do it and then say, no, no, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. No, no, definitely wasn't me. Um, there seems to be just a disconnect between what people say, what happens, and then the accountability for clearly what they've actioned, essentially. And the Americans absolutely blew that pipeline up and destroyed Russian gas coming into to Ukraine because Biden was, well, to be honest, Biden was Biden. And that's his Ukraine has been his project for a very very long time. So we're at that point, then obviously Germany stops getting cheap Russian gas and has to start firing up. It can't rely on all of its renewables. Has to start looking at refueling and getting their old nuclear reactors up and running again. Otherwise, they're going to have brownouts and this kind of good stuff. The cost base of new energy that is being imported via LNG into various terminals in Brussels and Netherlands or whatever, piped across to Germany, and I'm sure they've got their own terminals to take LNG as well. The cost of that energy is like another 40% of what they were paying before. So, yeah, the cost of everything just went shooting up, which obviously affects your economy. So your economy starts to tank a bit. And the only way and that was so the last, I suppose, so Angela Merkel and such like, who was the last leader of Germany before. Oh, is that right? Or was there someone else? No, I might have that wrong. Don't take that as right. But essentially, what you've got is you've got the last leader before Friedrich Merz, who just got in. Basically, the economy's tanking, didn't know what to do. What Friedrich Merz has done is he's like taken off the debt brake, and what he means by that is he's not just like they're not just going to industrialize for the things that they want to sell. They're actually they're industrializing to revitalize their military industrial complex. Um, Now in the UK, we've got quite a lot of memories of what happens when Germany starts to rearm, and so I'm not sure this might necessarily be a good idea. As Europeans, and I think I've said this before, we don't generally have a good history of going into Russia and coming out in the same shape that we went in. We usually come out a lot worse off for it. Essentially, you can go back to the Napoleonic Wars. Had a bit of a disastrous campaign in Russia, not so good with the Second World War for Germany either. They got absolute tanking. One thing that people don't realize about the Second World War, and something that I find fascinating, it was actually the Second World War that kind of drew me into history because it's such a big story. It's such a wild story. Um, But people don't often appreciate how Russia essentially won that war. And that's me not saying I'm pro-Russian or support Putin. I definitely don't. But I am, you have to give credit where credit's due. And there are some times when you have to say, yeah, the Russians did more than their fair share when it came to defeating in 1930s Germany. And they did that by essentially giving ground. They were getting beaten by the German blitzkrieg maneuver warfare of the time, which isn't too dissimilar to the combined arms tactics the Americans and NATO forces use. And the combined arms tactics or kind of combined arms warfare is kind of similar in the way that you probe for gaps and then you exploit that and then you maneuver behind the enemy lines to such a point where you create pockets and that collapses large sections of lines and you have to retreat very fast. Otherwise, you're just going to end up with very patchy parts of resistance and no way to supply them. So it's a very clever tactic. It takes years and years to develop. Um, Sorry, I've still got this cold. It still hasn't quite gone. Actually, I don't think it's a cold. I think I suffer badly from hay fever. So apologies if you hear my nose making little noises every now and then. I know it's not very nice, but yeah, there's a lot of pollen out there, so you can maybe see the red eyes a little bit too. I have taken Piriton and such like, but sometimes it doesn't really touch the sides. Anyways, so what I was talking about was Russia in the Second World War. 28 million Russians died. A lot of civilians, obviously. But what they did during that war, and what they did very effectively, is they gave ground and they moved all of their production behind the Ural Mountains, which is a long, long way from the lines. And they knew that they could if they moved everything over towards that part, then they could produce all the weaponry that they needed, and certainly or take in a lot of the weaponry from like ports like Murmansk and stuff like that. Which, to be fair to the Americans and the Brits and stuff, we absolutely supplied as much as we could to Russia. There was one of the few really untold stories. And I suppose one of these things that you don't really see too often in wartime stories, or certainly wartime histories, is the Arctic convoys and what they went through to get arms into Russia. Because we as British and Americans knew that if Russia collapsed, that was it. It was game over. And the reason for that is that at any one time, the Russians were dealing with a somewhere between a half and three quarters of the entire German army for the entire time that they were fighting. The Russians and the Germans were fighting each other. Half to three quarters. That's a hell of a lot. That's a hell of a lot. That's a hell of a lot of men and material. That's a hell of a lot of people. So when we talk about like the Normandy invasions and what the campaigns in North Africa and actually the campaigns in North Africa and then on into like Sicily and Italy and stuff like that, these were tiny, small pinprick campaigns for the Germans. Really, their main focus was the Eastern Front, and the Russians absolutely destroyed the Germans in that war, and they did it with some very very clever generals. They did it by being utterly ruthless as well. And I don't think the Russian demographic has actually recovered from that. To be honest, I think the Second World War has really. I think Russian population is about 140 million. I think without the Second World War, you'd probably be looking at a country the size, have population the size of America by now. I think it's that kind of level of damage that's been done to Russia, and Germany was slightly more protected in the sense that it's a much more concentrated place and piece of land, whereas Russia's much bigger. So it's easier to migrate within Europe than it is to within Russia, and then all of the history post World War obviously kind of separated Russia from Europe, I suppose, as well. So Europe recovered a lot faster than Russia did. Although to be fair, actually, when was it? I think it was like 2006. I did a little bit of touring around Europe with my wife, and what was really interesting was in Berlin there was actually still bomb damage. They were still repairing bomb damage in 2006 from the Second World War. Which is like 60 odd years later, which is was incredible to me. It was like walking down some streets in Berlin, and there were still the bullet holes or like the shell holes or whatever had impacted those buildings. there was still those moments where you could actually walk down certain streets, and I'm sure they've probably disappeared by now because I know that Berlin went through a huge reconstruction project during that time. But yeah, it was utterly mental walking down streets and seeing bullet holes and stuff like that from like 60 years previously, which was incredible. Anyway, I'm massively off track, so let's get back on track. The point I'm making is that you've got. I was talking about Germany rearming and reindustrializing, how badly it's done with Russia and such. Like, we are living in an absolute dream world if we think that we can take on Russia, and it's not because um, they have better weaponry or better tactics, or we have better weaponry or better tactics. I think it's been really shown. The Ukraine war has really shown how the parity of warfare between, say, like you call it near peer warfare, is what essentially it's not something America has done recently. So, whenever America has gone into countries like Iraq, Syria, wherever they've gone in, it's not against near peers. It's against people that are like 40 years, 60 years behind them, type thing. So when America took on Iraq, you had that like M1 Abrams tanks going up against T-55s. I mean, the distance, sorry, uh, the distance in parity between those two types of tanks is ridiculous. Like the M1 Abrams could fire so much further away with much heavier, like depleted uranium shells and things like that. The T-55s just never stood a chance. I mean, there was just like they were outgunned, outmanned, and outclassed basically. So you're not fighting against a near peer. You're fighting against a second or a third tier country when you do that. However, the difference between um, Russian soldiers, and I'm talking about professional soldiers here, not people that have been conscripted or whatever. The difference between Russian soldiers and their Ukrainian peers who were trained for 8 years to NATO standards, and people should remember that, is that's essentially near peers. Now they are near peer in the sense that they have similar types of weaponry. They have kind of combating tactics, slightly different tactics in how they operate. Whereas Russia is much more about force of artillery. NATO is much more about combined arms, which takes a long time to learn. Have the Ukrainians managed to do that effectively? Yeah, possibly you could argue they did during late 2022 when they reclaimed a lot of the Kharkiv region, certainly around like Liman and stuff like that. They had a huge amount of success doing that. But the Russians displayed at that point that they're prepared to give up territory. Like they're not going to defend the indefensible, whereas Ukrainians have demonstrated that they will defend the indefensible. So, like for instance, some of their fortress towns that they had built up since 2014, before the special military operation started in 2022, that's all. Some of those were nearly cut off, and you could see that people were getting surrounded, and they just fought until they were surrounded. So that to me shows the difference in ethos on how the wars are conducted or how their operations are conducted. So we're in this position right now where Zelensky doesn't want to negotiate. It's very obvious he doesn't want to give up any part of Ukraine. The Russians are demanding that he does, because how are you going to make us get out? That's basically what they're saying. And indeed, that's true. How are you going to make Russia give up parts of Ukraine? They're not going to. Um, so you've got these two forces at loggerheads with each other. And shortly after that non-meeting in London, Witkoff, who's the Trump's envoy, flew to Russia. And on the day that happened, the Ukrainians assassinated a Russian general as a statement, essentially. So you've got this statement by the Ukrainians saying that, yeah, we can get to you anytime we want. We're going to keep assassinating your top generals because that's what we're doing. One thing that should be mentioned here is that that's been the Ukrainian playbook since 2014, is that they have been out assassinating the people they deem enemies of their state. And that's, yeah, yeah, there's some intricacies with that. The real thing to identify here is that it's the CIA and America that were helping them do that, because the Ukrainians couldn't do that on their own. There's no two ways about it. And so we're in this really odd situation where you've got Ukrainians essentially executing some operations and whatnot, but they can't do that without American assistance or European assistance. And then you've got the Russians on the other side who are receiving, getting into all these fights and whatever. This is my dog has just come back. You might see him on the screen. So we're in this funny state right now where we've got this. I suppose the Americans are acting as mediators for a war that they're kind of perpetrating in the background, which is a really really interesting position to be. The last thing to mention about what's going on today at the moment is that there's some odd stuff going on with, and this is separate to the Ukraine war. There's some odd stuff going on with UK scientists are about to attempt to dim the sun. So we're going to be using chemicals to try and reduce sunlight or de-seed or reseed certain clouds. I've been looking into this, and this is one of these things that just seems a little odd, to be honest. Why would we try and engineer dimming of the sun to cool down the planet? Why not just reduce the chemicals that are causing the problems to the planet? So I just wanted to end the show there, and yeah, I'll see you for tomorrow's episode. Take care. Bye bye.